Studies show civic engagement is down in America. So how do we change that? Coming up, ideas and questions from our studio audience for a panel of experts. It's all next on Learning to Give, a WGVU Town Hall. Welcome to Learning to Give at WGVU Town Hall. I'm Fred Martino. A number of studies show that young people are not giving of their time and money at the rate of previous generations. They're also a lot less likely to vote. If current trends are not reversed, rates of civic engagement in America will continue to decline. Studies indicate that civic engagement has been dropping steadily since 1960, and now we're at a low not seen since the Great Depression. That's where Learning to Give comes in. It's a project of the Council of Michigan Foundations. The Muskegon-based organization has worked with more than 30 Michigan schools to offer lesson plans and train teachers. Grand Valley is the lead university, and Learning to Give is piloted in more and more schools, and there are plans for national and international partnerships. Coming up, we're going to talk with Learning to Give's executive director and Michigan educators. But first, our guests this half hour include Dr. Robert Grimm of the Corporation for National and Community Service based in Washington, D.C., and also Dr. Joel Westheimer. He is co-director of Democratic Dialogue at the University of Ottawa. Thank you both for joining us. First off, Dr. Grimm, tell us a little bit about your organization and why it exists. We've heard about civic engagement, and I know that's a big part of it.
The Corporation for National and Community Service is a federal agency whose purpose is to promote volunteering and civic behaviors in the United States. We have a variety of programs. One of our most known programs is AmeriCorps, which this year will include about 75,000 Americans who go out and decide to spend many times a year of their lives devoted to serving their communities. And we at the Corporation are very interested in how we can improve and increase civic engagement in America, because we think it's a very important part of a vital democracy.
Okay, Dr. Westheimer, I know as well, Democratic Dialogue is making a lot of changes, and you have a lot of interesting ideas. Tell us about your organization.
Well, our organization started out of a concern that public schooling in America was losing some of its original focus, which was on educating for democratic citizenship, meaning what kind of education needs to take place in K-12 schools to teach students how to be a democratic citizen, how to participate in a democracy. And so what we're trying to do is highlight attention and focus and research and discussion, just like on programs like this, about the democratic purposes of schooling. In other words, what roles do schools have in democratic societies?
And, you know, if you look at voting trends, the schools can have a big role, correct? I mean, if we look at how often 18 to 24-year-olds vote, it's not very good, is it?
It's not very good right now, and schools can have a tremendous effect. In fact, we turn to schools to educate on all kinds of issues that are going on in society. They're the catch-all for everything, right? Driver's ed and any problem that's going on in society. And this, we all know from many different sectors, is a problem, declining civic engagement. And we're hoping that schools can help to address that problem. Okay,
and we do have a way to do that today by starting a dialogue about this issue, and we have a lot of folks who are just ready to answer questions, and why don't you come on up. We have first with us today, you have two questions. Richard Kramer.
Yes. How much do anger, struggle, desperation, and unrest motivate social action? And has the generous hard work of the World War II generation made our society so comfortable that we are now immune to the need for social action?
All right, why don't we start off that both of you answer that one. It's a good general question about what's behind this.
I think your question really gets at the core of why we have a voluntary sector or a philanthropic sector. You know, one of the things I recently did a few years ago was do a book on the history of important givers and volunteers. And what motivates these kind of people, often they're social entrepreneurs that see problems in society. They either see injustice. If you think about civil rights, if you think about women's rights, if you think about the abolition movement, if you think about all kinds of social changes that have occurred in our society, they have been initiated often by private citizens who take a look at society and say, I could make it better, I could improve it. And that's an important kind of part of society that we want to always incubate and support. It's important to have these kind of social entrepreneurs, whether they're angry or upset or controversial. That's important because they change our society and they push us, and I think they make us better. So that, I think, is an important part of thinking about the voluntary civic sector.
Yeah, I'll add that one of the things that Joe Kahn of Mills College and I have been doing research for several years on, and one of the major things that we've found about civic engagement, we've talked about the 3 C's of civic engagement that programs have that work successfully: commitment, capacity, and connection. And your question goes right to the first one, the commitment. And one of the things we found is that successful programs first need to teach students that things need improving, right? Why would students be engaged if they don't think anything's wrong? And we live in a society that is obsessed with showing that everything is right, you know, and that we can all we need to do is to shop and to take care of our individual needs rather than looking around us at what needs improving. And programs that do give students an understanding that there are things out there that are not well, right? That not everyone is as lucky, perhaps, as some of the students that these programs are reaching. Those are the kinds of feelings that we want to inculcate in students, and anger is a healthy response to some of those experiences where they get angry because in, for example, the richest country, in one of the richest countries in the world, how is it possible that there are so many people who don't have health care, or how is it possible that so many people are living on the street? Those are things to get angry about, and anger is a good motivating starting point for civic action, as Bob pointed out.
It's all how you direct the anger, right? Okay, and Richard, you have another question for Dr. Westheimer.
Is our U.S. school system engendering so-called good students who do what they're told to do and then become good citizens who simply do what they're supposed to do? Should our school system, or does our school system instead need to create dynamic students who take civic action?
So more creative thinking is kind of what you're getting at here.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a really good question, and I actually think a very important issue to bring up, because first of all, the vast majority of programs in the country right now that address education for democracy focus on a kind of personal responsibility. Programs like character education, the Points of Light Foundation, many programs that fall into this arena focus on this idea of giving back, which of course is always a good thing, volunteering and having good character. And in good character often includes things like loyalty and obedience, like the questioner talked about. And surely we know that, of course, students need to learn to follow rules and to pay attention to, you know, social rules and to be socialized into society. But it can't stop there if we're really serious about democracy, because what democracy requires is something more than following rules. Democracy requires citizens to be engaged in helping to shape, reshape, create, criticize, and basically make those rules.
And I guess you would make the argument that getting out of the classroom, getting into the community, fosters that.
It can. It doesn't have to, but I think it's an important first step. But getting out of the classroom and working in the community, coupled with the kind of reflection about those activities that teach students about addressing root causes of problems, that's what can make it happen.
Okay, we have another question. Ann Burgess for both of our guests.
Is there a growing trend in which people are contributing to the private sector monetarily versus giving of their time? Is there some concern with this possible trend?
I'll take that one first. I think that is a trend that we see with a number of organizations. Some of our larger nonprofit organizations no longer require you to have to go to meetings or to participate. Your participation is you mail in a check. Well, certainly that is a generous behavior, but it isn't going to engender very much civic behavior. You're not going to have much social interaction with other people in the community. And I think it is a concern if our larger nonprofits or larger voluntary associations, your main experience is just, well, I write a check. that's not going to promote any kind of important civic behavior. So as we see certain organizations like that, I think there is a concern that they're not building up the kind of what we call social capital, kind of bonds of trust and interaction that really facilitate, I think, democracy.
And Joel, I guess to clarify as well, both volunteering of time and money, both are down, right?
Yeah, volunteerism is actually up recently.
But since 1960, it's been quite a decline.
It has been a decline, but interestingly, specific to that question, we really have entered a time when the idea of writing a check or doing a quick volunteer job in the community is what's considered all that's needed. And there's no historical evidence, there's no social movement in the history of our country that points to the idea that that's going to be enough. And that's actually a real problem. The book Downsizing Democracy has this great example that when Pearl Harbor was bombed, the citizens were asked to volunteer for the war effort, to sign up, to commit to their communities, to their societies, to do all kinds of things, basically to temporarily change their lives to address the needs of the country. After September 11th, on the other hand, most people were asked to shop. Right, to go shopping. And that's actually not going to be enough to get the kind of civic engagement that we really need. Okay,
another question now from Annette Peterson.
In your opinion, what is the main factor in the steady decline of volunteerism and civic participation since 1960?
Okay, very good question for both of our guests.
Yeah.
Dr. Grimm.
I'll take it first. I mean, I think that one of the most important books that has really influenced our thinking on this is Bob Putnam published a book a couple of years ago called Bowling Alone. And he illustrates a number of reasons why people are not meeting with their neighbors to play cards, not attending clubs, things of that nature. One of them he cites as one of the big factors is television, that we're fatigued at the end of the day, we sit down, we watch the TV, and we don't even interact with anyone else. I mean, even if we sit down with family members, we're just focusing there right on the tube, and we're not really interacting. But there certainly are other reasons why that have occurred. There are certainly changes that have occurred positive in our society that we need to maybe think about how to refocus it. Much of civic engagement and voluntary activity decades ago were done by women because they didn't have careers. Now, as both parents are, or both women and men are working full-time, often long hours, they are not able to be involved as much in civic engagement. So we need to think about imaginative ways that we can increase civic engagement. And
not so imaginative ways, right? I mean, one of the things that I saw that was really striking to me was the prevalence of families today who don't have dinner together, and that was cited as a major issue.
Right, so I think there's some basics, if we could get back to some of the basics, like meeting with family, and then also thinking about how technology is not maybe something to promote disengagement, but could be used in ways to promote engagement in people's lives that are very busy. And the last kind of cause that I'll cite, and then Joel may want to talk about some others, is that we've actually kind of had a good amount of sprawl in our communities. So we live farther away from our neighbors, we live farther away in our communities, and so there's not as much interaction.
So if you've got to go to a particular organization, you got to hop in the car to go do it. You're not going to walk to it.
And you may not see your neighbors as much as you might see in decades ago. So there are a number of forces, I think, that are pushing us towards civic engagement, civic disengagement. That doesn't mean, I don't think, that it's always going to be that way. And what it means is that society changes, and we have to change with it. We have to think about ways we can transform society to promote better civic engagement.
Yeah, I think that Bob is exactly right, and in fact the Robert Putnam book that he was quoting from, one of my favorite parts of that is Robert Putnam says, we're starting to watch Friends on TV instead of having them. And really that's true, that a lot of civic engagement starts with social and interpersonal interactions, and because we're becoming much more privatized, much more individualized in our paying attention to TV and to the internet, that we sort of retreat into our own little worlds and aren't out there. But I think that's only the first step. And of course, television is just a very powerful tool. Like, look at this town hall. We're having right here. It's a tool that doesn't necessarily work towards any one thing or another, and as is the internet. And if there are more shows where big ideas are talked about, that ask people to engage and participate in what's going on in their communities and learn about affairs, not just a 5-second soundbite of it, but really engage with the issues, that can be a powerful influence for people getting civically involved. But the other trend that I think, I'll just say one more thing about this, is that really for the last several decades we've had this steady increase in the idea that the purpose of life in this country is to amass as many possible things and amounts of wealth as possible, and not benefit from our interactions with other people, with helping others, and with trying to improve society. And that's so tragic for a number of reasons. One, it's bad for our society because we have people retreating from the public sector and looking only to personal gain as a sort of end point for their life. But it's also sad from an individual perspective because that endpoint is never going to be satisfying to anyone. And if you talk to anyone who's been involved in social causes and social movements, that's where their lifeblood is. I mean, that's where people, that's where they get their energy from, and their sustenance is from that kind of engagement.
I think you've really hit on something there, that defining how do we increase civic engagement may be a matter of redefining for many people what is success.
Absolutely.
Is success a material thing, or is it how involved we are in our communities, in our families, and helping other people?
Absolutely, and I do think, echoing what Bob said, that it's hard to do that when television is filled, for example, with The Apprentice. If Donald Trump is going to be our
winners and losers,
is going to be our showcase of what a successful citizen is, we have a problem.
Okay, we have another question from Mary Beth McMahon.
Thank you. I'm an 8th grade teacher. Can you suggest ways how we can restructure our student council in order to promote active citizenship beyond voting on school dances?
Sure, I'll start with that, and Bob can chime in. I think that we all know that student councils can be a sort of exercise in kind of comic futility, right? Where students are getting together to vote on things that nobody cares about, and that even then those decisions are sort of advisory to the administration. And so if their time is taken up with deciding what color napkins are going to be at the school dance, and what flavor of punch is going to be served, that's a travesty of what the point of student councils is. But there are a growing number of schools in this country and around the world, actually, that are taking seriously the idea that students can be engaged with real issues in shaping the school policies and their education. Now, that does not mean, as many people like to think of this, that the kids are in charge. Kids are kids, and teachers as adult role models will always shape the education and the curriculum. They need to. But teachers and the adults in the school can create space for students to make important decisions that affect their lives. And I said this yesterday at a lecture I was giving, that can't happen if only the students are doing that. We have too many schools in this country where teachers have no say in what goes on in the school. And you can't have a double standard like that, where you're trying to, this double message, you're trying to teach students to have control and have say in the conditions of their school, when teachers don't have that. So it has to start with teachers being involved in managing their school.
Sure, earlier we heard about a suggestion that students need to be more creative. You're saying as well that in the classroom, teachers have to be given the ability to be more creative as well.
Absolutely, and not only in the classroom, but in the hallways and everywhere, in every aspect of the school.
Okay, Dr. Grimm, is that a pipe dream, though? Because we are in, I think, you tell me if I'm wrong, in a situation right now where we're going the other way with the prevalence of standardized testing, and you have to have this, and this on the multiple choice test. Is that going to be even harder to do to try to increase creativity in the classroom and among students?
I think standards are a good thing. I think that we all agree that we want to have our students have certain skills and proficiencies. But I think that doesn't mean that we can't be creative. and that we can't be imaginative in working to those standards, and also to thinking about other ways to promote civic engagement. I mean, one of the things I think that's important for student councils is to make sure that they are laboratories of democracy. And by being laboratories, they're actual, as Joel is suggesting here, you're actually making some valuable decisions. Otherwise, we're training people that it doesn't really matter what you think or what your votes are or what your beliefs are. And so if we don't make them true laboratories of democracy in some kind of way, then they're actually doing worse. I think they're making it, the civic engagement, worse for us.
And we have to move on, Dr. Westheimer, but I have to ask this question. This has to go beyond the classroom, correct? I mean, it has to be in the fact that the policies for the student newspaper, student media, have to be clear, that students have freedom and ability to express themselves. Otherwise, students getting a mixed message may be actually damaging, do you think?
Well, let me say two things about that. First of all, on the question you just posed, Fred, that yes, students need to be able to participate relatively freely in some form of kind of a democratic laboratory, right? But on the other hand, there are places for adults to offer guidance and careful supervision of what's going on. So when we have kids practice democracy, it's the same as having them practice learning how to drive a car. You don't just give them the keys to the car and let them take off. So
and as we've seen in the quote-unquote real world, the FCC makes those cases as well. As far as there are boundaries, no matter where you are, but getting at the point that it has to go beyond the classroom.
It does, and can I say one other thing, just because you asked about standards and testing? I'm going to be a little harder hitting on this. I actually, of course, there's no one who's against standards. We all have standards. You can't find a teacher in this country who doesn't have standards for their kids to achieve. But the certain aspects of No Child Left Behind, which in some sectors has been really helpful in raising those standards, have in other places been incredibly detrimental to the kind of work that I'm talking about here, because of a narrowly scripted idea of what education is in any locale that prevents some of this work from going on. And it's why No Child Left Behind in some circles among educators has been called No Child Left Untested, or even No Child Left.
Well, right, and it may not even be that creativity is banned. It's just maybe there may not be time for some of these other very, very crucial lessons.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have another question now. Tim Taylor. Hi, Tim.
Thank you. Okay, author Brian O'Connell writes that the past was not nearly as good as remembered, and the present is far better than perceived when speaking about civic spirit. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I think that's a really good point. That's important for us to take a long perspective. I often generally consider myself an historian, and we should recognize that people had trouble with civic engagement in the past. Even in times like the 19th century, when we believe that Alex de Tocqueville came from France and wrote Democracy in America and talked about how all these voluntary associations were sprouting up all over the place. You could still find many cities saying, we had these political meetings and no one came, or only 2 people came. And so I think the lesson there is that civic engagement is hard work. It's not easy. And so certainly we have trends now to be concerned, but there have been trends historically that concern us, and that civic engagement is hard work. You have to work at it to really have strong civic engagement.
Yeah, the one thing I'd add to that about this idea of the golden past is how detrimental it is to encouraging students to be civically engaged today, because this golden past also works like, for example, people will talk about the civil rights movement. Oh, well, wouldn't it be good if we had issues that were as clear today as the civil rights movement, that was so crystal clear, there was a good side and a bad side? But that's historically inaccurate, and any historian will tell you that. At the time, the civil rights movement was just as blurry as some of our major issues today. And frankly, how could anyone think that some issues aren't clear today? We live in one of the wealthiest countries in the world where 40 million people don't have health insurance, right? That is a travesty. We have record numbers of homeless. We have hunger in this country. Those are clear issues, and those are issues that kids need to know that they need to get involved in.
Yeah, and if I could just add one thing before we go on, that's a very good point. If we think about slavery, today you would survey anyone and you'd ask, was slavery a good thing? No one would say yes. Now, in the 19th century, when there were abolitionists, they were a very small minority of the population. It was, most people thought slavery was okay, or I don't really care. And so I think it's an important lesson to realize that issues that we see people making social movements on have always been minority groups and small groups who are willing to take a chance and go out there and push a certain kind of agenda.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. I mean, you hear students talk about, oh, if only it was certain students, so if only it was the 60s when there was a mass movement to get involved in these kinds of ways. But you know that wasn't true either. Opposition to the Vietnam War, for example, was in small sectors of society on small campuses that got a lot of press, and some of them far smaller than some of our youth movements today that are working towards issues.
Okay, another question now from Carolyn Clark.
Thank you. Doesn't government have a selfish interest in promoting volunteerism?
Yes, but I think that everyone has a selfish interest. If you asked businesses, if you asked private individuals, do you have an interest in promoting volunteerism? I'd say yes. I mean, one of the interesting things, Robert Putnam I mentioned his Bowling Alone book. He recently, before that he published a book looking at Italy. And one of the things he talked about, why was that society effective? It was because the social capital, the kind of bonds of trust and that we talked about, and the bonds of the interactions that occurred through choral societies and other kinds of groups. Volunteerism builds up good connective tissue in societies. And I think that it's important for democracy to exist, to have citizens who are active and engaged. So certainly I think for government, for business, and for private individuals, we all have a self-interest in seeing volunteerism.
Karen, let me see if I can kind of read between the lines here a little bit. I'm guessing that with your question, you have a concern that there are certain things in society where we do not want a variability in terms of support, financial or otherwise, that we want a steady level of support that we can depend upon. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yes, exactly. And also, doesn't government kind of decide which issues are going to be funded and which issues they are going to walk away from and depend upon the citizens to step in and take that over?
So it's a real concern.
I'd like to say something to Karen, which is it's a really good question, but there's an echo in that question of government as they. Right? There's government over there. Does government have a selfish concern that doesn't apply to our selfish concern? Well, welcome to democracy, folk, right? Government is we. It's we the people. And this idea of government as something out there that does bad things and that we the people are the ones who have to curb it in is not consistent with our sort of best vision of what democracy is, right?
So again, like we were saying earlier, getting beyond the obvious, going to the roots of things here, we also have to make sure that students find ways to get involved in democracy, because I would imagine, just like a lot of adults, there are a lot of teenagers who believe, I don't really have a voice beyond the ballot box, that how can I have an impact? These aren't my candidates, these aren't my issues, right?
Right. And I think that one of the reasons we see concerns about civic disengagement is this mentality that you suggest here, that government acts on us and that government makes decisions and then we have to respond. That's not how a productive civil society works. We drive government. The people drive government. That's the way it should be seen.
Okay. Very interesting. And we have one more. One more? So you're going to stay there. All right. Well, we will have more questions from our audience. We ran out of time for this half hour. See, I wanted to keep the conversation going. We'll be back in just a moment.